It's time for the Ghoulie Girls.
A small village, formerly known as North Tarrytown, is located along the east side of the Hudson River and just 25 miles from Manhattan. It would go on to become the inspiration for America's original ghost story. The haunts and legend of Sleepy Hollow begins in 1609 when the land was still occupied by the Wakaschik Indian tribe and the new Dutch settlers colonized the area to the New Netherland. At first, the Dutch settlers and the Wakaschik had a friendly relationship, but that relationship came to an end by 1643 when the Dutch were at war with all the tribes of the region. And when the British took over the Dutch colonies, a Dutchman named Frederick Phillips purchased the land in hopes of farmers populating the area through means of liberal leases. Settlement in the North Tarrytown was low, but for Sunday services, the local church became a social gathering for all the neighboring areas. As the population of the village grew, Dutch customs were still in influence on the area, including old folklore and chilling ghost stories. These tales and customs left a lasting impression on a young writer named Washington Irving. Irving was born and raised in Manhattan to a successful merchant family. He was named after the first American president, George Washington, whom he got to meet at age 6, a memorable event that Irving would commemorate with a watercolor painting. Although a very creative young man, Irving struggled with his studies at school and much preferred going out for adventures. He would get his taste for adventure in 1798 when the city of Manhattan was swept with yellow fever and Irving was sent to stay at Tarrytown with friend James Kirk Paulding. During his stay at Tarrytown, the two young boys would often venture out to the neighboring North Tarrytown, where they got to hear the local tales of haunts and superstitions of the small village. The old customs of the quaint town gave it such a mystifying charm that it stirred Irving's wild imagination that it would live on with him even years later. In 1807, Irving, along with his older brother and friend James Kirk Paulding, founded a satire literary magazine called Salmagundi, in which he wrote various short stories under various pen names. The magazine was a moderate success, and in one issue he referred to New York as Gotham, a name that Batman creator Bob Kane would later use for the fictional city in the Batman and DC comics. Despite Irving's success as a writer, in 1815 he would have to put his writing aside and dedicate 2 years of his life to try and bail the family business from facing bankruptcy, an attempt that ultimately failed. While living in England, he befriended fellow writer Walter Scott. Scott and Irving had a common passion for German folklore, mythology, and the works of the Brothers Grimm. They were both particularly fond of stories involving ghosts. These types of stories inspired both of them to take a more fantastical approach to their work. Irving again turned to writing, and while staying with his sister in Birmingham, he wrote a short story overnight called Rip Van Winkle. It was the first of many short stories and essays that Irving would publish in a paper called The Sketchbook of Geoffrey Crayon. A common thread in all of the stories of the sketchbook was the narration of Irving's pen name, Geoffrey Crayon, which became a persona that would often be confused with Irving's own public persona. These series of short stories were a popular success, and even though Irving had traveled the world, it was his memorable visit to North Tarrytown that inspired his next short story, The Legend of Sleepy Hollow. If you're not familiar with how the story of Sleepy Hollow goes, it follows the character of Ichabod Crane, who is a schoolmaster, and upon his arrival to Sleepy Hollow, he becomes enamored with the beautiful Katrina Van Tassel. Ichabod learns about the local legend of the Headless Horseman, who is said to be a malevolent spirit of the Hessian soldier who was decapitated by a cannonball during the Revolutionary War. The legend goes that the horseman rises from the grave to seek a new head to replace his own. Although Irving's telling of the horseman is the most well-known interpretation, it wasn't the first. Folklore and legends of headless horsemen go as far back as the Middle Ages. In Irish folklore, there is the Dullahan, a dark mythical creature that is said to take the form of a headless horseman or woman riding a black horse and carrying its own severed head. Although detached from the rest of the body, the head possesses supernatural vision, which enables the Dullahan to see in far distances for souls to collect. The Dullahan is also depicted as a headless coachman driving a silent death coach that's pulled by 6 black horses. The Dullahan is seen as the omen of death, similar to the Grim Reaper. It comes for those who are at death's door. When it's time for a soul to be collected, the Dullahan will arrive at the person's home and call out their name. And for those whose souls the Dullahan is not seeking, still need to be cautious of crossing its path. Although the Dullahan won't spare you, he'll blind those who look directly at him by either throwing a basin of blood on their eyes or whipping them with a whip made of human spine. The Legend of Sleepy Hollow was a popular edition of the sketchbook series. Irving's blend of urban myths and old folklore infused the real location and people make the stories behind the legend even more interesting. The name Katrina Van Tassel comes from the young lady whose family Irving had briefly lodged with, and the characteristics of Ichabod Crane is believed to be based on a real schoolmaster named Jesse Merwin. But the name came from an army captain named Ichabod Bennett Crane, who Irving had met while he worked as an assistant to the governor of New York. Irving passed away in November 1859 at age 76. His body was laid to rest at the Sleepy Hollow Cemetery. Irving spent his last days of his life at his home in Tarrytown. It's said that his former home is haunted by his ghost and that he's particularly fond of female visitors. The legend of Sleepy Hollow forever immortalized the small village that it was based on, and by 1996, North Tarrytown was officially renamed to Sleepy Hollow in honor of its historic roots. The Old Dutch Church and the Sleepy Hollow Cemetery are the oldest in New York State. And just like it was during the Dutch colonies, there is still a lot of superstition that surrounds the village. Reports of the frequent paranormal activity, especially in its older downtown buildings, include disembodied voices, phantom footsteps, and orbs appearing in pictures. Not surprising is that the cemetery is believed to be the most haunted spot in the town. At the very top of the cemetery is the mausoleum of General Samuel Thomas, who passed away in 1903. His widow Anne decided it would be nice to have a beautiful bronze statue made in his honor. She hired renowned sculptor Andrew O'Connor to make the statue, but upon its completion, Mrs. Thomas was disappointed that the expression on the face of the statue was somber. She requested that the statue's face be redone to look more jovial. Mrs. Thomas was much more pleased with the new face that O'Connor had sculpted. But as an act of defiance, the sculptor smashed the new head and basically told her not to criticize his work and that she'll have to settle with the original. Mrs. Thomas passed away in 1944 and was laid to rest with her husband. The bronze lady that she detested still stands across from the family mausoleum, keeping an eye on them at all times. It's said that the bronze lady comes to life every night to wander the grounds of the cemetery and that you can hear the loud sounds of her weeping. There are many stories of curses associated with the bronze lady and has become a rite of passage for those that dare to see if the stories are true. In one version, it's said that if you sit on the statue's lap, that you will cry tears of blood. And others claim that if you insult her, you will be plagued with bad luck forever. And the real village of Sleepy Hollow wouldn't be complete without its own tales of headless haunt. Even though it's just an invention of Irving's imagination, there are those who insist that the headless specter is real and that Irving was inspired by an actual Hessian soldier that was decapitated by a cannonball. It's said that late at night, a tall dark figure of a disembodied man is known to wander the grounds of the cemetery. And just up ahead, leading to the dark forest of Sleepy Hollow, is the Horseman's Bridge, with many claiming that the sounds of galloping hooves can be heard echoing through the night. So maybe the legend of the Headless Horseman is more than just folklore after all. Now, it's time for some Ghoul Talk.
Let's talk about scary things.
Okay, well, I know that Sleepy Hollow and the Horsemen are typically associated with Halloween, but considering we do a ghost podcast, it's pretty much Halloween themed all the time, so it's up for game. Yeah, so I just thought it was really interesting to learn more about Washington Irving and his career and, you know, the folklore and tales that inspired him to make one of America's greatest ghost stories.
Yeah, me too. It seems like he took, parts of history and, like you said, the folklore and real people's names. Mm-hmm. That's really interesting.
He does what real writers do. They write what inspired, made something so historical to where there have been even Disney cartoons, Sleepy Hollow motion picture film directed by Tim Burton. And what great American history do we have that we actually have the real Sleepy Hollow here in America? That's interesting, and we should be very, proud of. We need to take a trip down there and see that because...
Yeah, that would be interesting. I think a lot of people don't realize that Sleepy Hollow is a real place,
And that's what's interesting. It's a real town. It's a real place.
I didn't even realize it was a real place until about 5 years ago.
Yeah, me too. Yeah, like a fictional town, just like Gotham, which that was also interesting to learn that Washington Irving coined the term Gotham.
Yeah, which I didn't know that. That's really cool.
How creative.
This town of Sleepy Hollow sounds like it's very supernatural, and that seems to have always been the case. That's why Washington Irving was inspired to make that the setting for his story. So yeah, and it sounds like it's still like that today. There's obviously a lot of activity, especially in the older parts of town.
Obviously, there's a lot of history there from it being Native American territory.
Mm-hmm. Plus the bloodshed of...
Yeah, for that reason.
The Dutch and the Indians going to war.
Yeah, that's true. Stuff like that. When there's a lot of tragedy, there's usually more activity.
I thought all the stories were interesting, especially the Irish folklore.
The Doulahan. Yeah, just like the one on Darby O'Gill and the Little People. I didn't know that was like...
Folklore.
Yeah.
I'm like, that's what they're called, huh? Or that's what he's called.
Yeah, the different versions of the Doulahan.
Yeah, because this one sounds very intense.
Because it could be a man or a woman.
Yeah.
It's just like, it's kind of cool knowing that it could actually be a woman.
Do you guys believe that Sleepy Hollow really does have its own Headless Horseman?
Yeah, I think it's really haunted.
I think so, yeah. I mean, well, of course, the Hessian soldier that he based the Headless Horseman on, a headless figure, has been seen walking the grounds of the cemetery. I thought that was really cool.
Yeah, when I heard that, I was wondering if it's really the Hessian, the ghost, or like on Sleepy Hollow, the movie, how those guys are just playing a prank on Ichabod. And I wonder if it's not true, if somebody's going to that extent, because it sounds like a lot of people have seen that.
But just as popular as the Headless Horseman is the Bronze Lady, which I thought was...
That's a really intense
apparition
of a statue coming to life and crying tears of blood.
Or plaguing a person with bad luck.
Yeah, for insulting her, like Annabelle the doll.
Yeah, it's just really weird, the things that people try out to see what the Bronze Lady will do to them.
And some things can be coincidental as well.
I definitely wouldn't want to mess with her.
No, I actually wouldn't either.
I mean, if we were to ever go to Sleepy Hollow and go to the cemetery, I think I would definitely steer clear of the Bronze Lady statue.
I don't even want to make fun of her at all.
I wouldn't even want a negative thought cross my mind
about her.
Like Ghostbusters, clear your heads.
Yeah, and no disrespect. It's like out of respect for her. I don't want to think anything negative about that lady.
But I definitely believe, there's just some places that have more energy than others. Like you said, the bloodshed for the war and the tragedy just amplifies the energy that's there.
Even though it's known to be one of the most haunted places in the world, it's also known to be one of the safest places to live in the world.
Oh, really?
So, yeah.
Then maybe I'll be moving to Sleepy Hollow.
Maybe. I'm a big collector of Headless Horseman stuff. Anytime I see anything of the Headless Horseman, it's mine.
Yeah.
So, like, New York has never been on my bucket list, but Sleepy Hollow is. Most people who've gone to Sleepy Hollow have gone there because they're in New York, and since it's just like a train trip away, then they just figured, why not?
Well, yeah.
For me, it's more going to Sleepy Hollow and then New York, maybe, since it's just a
Maybe.
train trip.
I've always wanted to go to New York.
I mean, I think just in general, all three of us, like, we really love the story of Sleepy Hollow. So, I mean, we grew up watching the Disney cartoon, like we said, and the Johnny Depp movie. So I think it would be a really cool place for us to go and see what we would actually experience and just, like, feel the history of it, you know, and, yeah, just see what we would actually experience.
A place in America, most likely hauntings. I mean, just sign me up. I want to go there and see more.
Thanks for watching. Be sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell if you don't want to miss out on any of our latest Ghoulie Tales.